Welcome back to our unit on Greek history. Today we're going to be looking at Alexander the Great's conquest of Persia. Now, when Alexander invaded Persia, he landed near the city of Troy. And he did this because in his favorite book or story, the Iliad, that is where the Trojans had landed. And Alexander had a plan in order to prevent the kind of difficulties that Achilles had experienced from occurring to him. So shortly after landing there, he went to the temple of Apollo just outside the city of Troy, and there he made up an offering to Apollo. I think that by doing this, what Alexander was trying to do was to appease Apollo and turn Apollo onto his side. Ultimately, Alexander believed that the Greeks had failed in the Trojan War, or failed to complete their task rapidly in the Trojan War as a result of the disfavor of the gods. And Alexander certainly didn't want that to happen. So he made up this offering and provided great information to, obeisance to the Greek gods in order to gain their favor. Now, Alexander then began to move into Asia, and he won battle after battle after battle, took city after city, and quickly became a real difficulty to Darius the Seventh, the king of Persia. However, there is one little story that I think it's interesting to tell, and that was that in a city in Asia Minor, there was a very special temple, and inside that temple was a cart that had a knot, and this city was called Gordian. And for a long time, there had been a legend that the Gordian knot would be undone by who was to become the ruler of Asia. Alexander obviously wanted to become the ruler of Asia, so he went to the city of Gordian and went there into the temple and looked at the knot, and this was a knot that was not going to get untied. It was very difficult, and many people had tried and failed to untie the knot. Alexander, though, comes into the temple, looks at the knot, pulls out his sword, and hacks through the knot, cutting it in two, and then proclaims that he has undone the knot, and that therefore he will become the master of Asia. From here, he moves on into the proper part of Asia, and first meets one of King Darius VII's armies at a little place called Issus, Issus. And this was quite a battle, and it was one of the first times where Alexander really had to test his skills and abilities with regard to the Persian army. Of course, he wins the battle. It was a very difficult battle, and he takes a lot of prisoners. As a result of this, Darius VII is thought to have written a letter to Alexander wherein he demands the prisoners back and offers some concessions, including maybe as much as half of his kingdom. Alexander then writes back to to Darius and offers him a number of things. And in addition to that, he includes some fairly strong language to King Darius, where he said to him, Darius, you killed my father. You are an usurper trying to take Macedonia. I will return the prisoners if you address me as king of all Asia. If you do not agree, you must fight me or I will hunt you down. Now, although this letter is a very interesting letter, it's likely not an authentic letter. It appears from the historical evidence that it was manufactured sometime probably in the early Middle Ages or the late Roman period. However, it is clear that this letter probably does reflect some of the thinking that Alexander was going off of at this time. Not only his animosity to Darius, but his understanding that his position with regard to Darius was significantly stronger than Darius wanted it to be. Alexander's next move was to go to the city of Tyre. And in the city of Tyre, there was a temple. And the temple was something that Alexander wanted to worship. It was a temple to a particular god by the name of Melkart. And Alexander went to the gates of the city of Tyre and requested entry to get into the city and worship at the temple of Melkart. The people of Tyre, though, having heard of Alexander's reputation, refused him entry. They were willing to do this because they were very confident. The city of Tyre was an island about a mile from the coast of the Mediterranean, and they were very confident that they were secure from Alexander's attacks. In fact, the city of Tyre had withstood a 10-year siege from King Nebuchadnezzar just before he became king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Alexander, not to be deterred, immediately comes up with a plan and tells his men to get to work. And the plan involves him building a causeway from the edge of the Mediterranean out to the island of Tyre itself. They drive piles into the bottom of the Mediterranean. Stones, wood, etc. are piled up in between the piles, and slowly the causeway inches its way out across the Mediterranean and approaches the city of Tyre. Now, Tyre gets very concerned and tired of Alexander's approach, and so they attempt to attack the causeway. They use something called a fire ship, where you load it full of oil, and you have this interesting little crock pot that is full of naphtha, a very flammable material, that swings on a rope at the front of the ship. They get the ship headed in the right direction, and then everybody bails off after they've lit this crock pot on fire. The idea is that the ship crashes into the causeway, the oil spills all over it, the crock pot breaks, dropping the flaming naphtha onto the causeway, and it burns down. And in fact, Tyre was very successful with this, and they caused a great deal of destruction to the causeway, and Alexander had to start all over. The second time, though, he thought he would be a little bit better with it, and he brought in some ships in order to protect the causeway from attacks by the Tyrian navy. As he got closer and closer to the city of Tyre began to be more concerned. There was basically arrows being fired, and the Tyrians were massing at the area where it was most likely that they would be able to be breached by Alexander's army. However, Alexander was very clever, found a spot on the southeastern side of the island where there was a small beach, just enough to land a couple of ships. He led an attack, landed the ships, climbed over the wall, ran to the city gates, fighting off the Tyrians, and opening the gates allowed the rest of his army to come in. Now, this whole process led to the death of many people. Alexander wanted to make sure that he taught all other cities a lesson, that you do not mess with Alexander. As a result, there were 6,000 men that were killed in the city. 2,000 additional men were crucified on the beach, and some 30,000 people were sold into slavery. This was really a difficult and terrible event that happened as part of Alexander's conquest. The evidence of this, or this causeway that he built, has actually changed the geography of the Mediterranean. Because of the causeway, sand, silt, and other materials built up along the edge of it. And today, this peninsula, it's no longer an island, juts out into the Mediterranean, and there are actually luxury hotels built on this little peninsula of land that was given to the Mediterranean courtesy of Alexander the Great. Now, Following the conquest of Tyre, Alexander moved on. He went to Jerusalem, which surrendered. He went to Egypt, which surrendered. And then he began to work his way back into the heart of the Persian Empire. Darius the 7th knew that he had to stop Alexander. If he couldn't stop Alexander, he was going to lose his entire kingdom. Finally, the two armies met at a place called Gaugamela. And the Battle of Gaugamela was quite a battle. Alexander lined his forces up, and as usual, Alexander took command of one of the cavalry wings that was on the right side of his offensive line. Alexander used the mobility of the cavalry to great effect. He swept around the Persian forces and drove right towards the heart of the Persian army, which is where King Darius sat in his chariot. As the historians tell it, as Darius saw that Alexander was getting closer and closer to him, he ultimately turned and fled the battlefield, leaving everything behind. He had his chariot drive away with the immortals guarding him just as fast as he could. It is believed that on this date, Alexander might have caught Darius and ended the Persian War right then. However, seeing that his army was in trouble because some of the forces of Darius had swung around and was attacking his infantry from their right flank, he abandoned his chase of Darius and went back to assist the army. In the aftermath of this battle, Alexander discovered that he had captured approximately a third of the Persian royal treasury, which was an enormous amount of money. And he also found that Darius had left behind on the battlefield his wife, his daughters, and his mother. Alexander took them into custody, and when he learned that they had been captured, Alexander went to visit them in their tent. He kneeled down, took their hand, and said, I will treat you as if you are my mother and my sisters. He appears to have kept that promise and treated the women very well. Following the Battle of Gaugamela, Alexander continued to chase Darius VII to Babylon, then to Susa, and finally to the city of Persepolis. Now, Persepolis was the capital of Persia, and Alexander arrives at the capital of Persia finding that Darius has fled just a few days before, allowing Alexander to take possession of the city and to occupy it. This was quite a boon for Alexander because he now had control of the capital city of Persia, as well as having control of the rest of the Persian Empire and just fabulous treasure and wealth. As a result of this, Alexander was quite elated, and a number of things took place in Persepolis. First, as a result of a party or a celebration, things got out of hand. His Greek soldiers became drunk on the wine, and some of them began to misbehave, and perhaps out of anger with the Persians, or perhaps out of an accident, they set the royal palace in Persepolis on fire. This was really a great tragedy because this building was rumored to be one of the most fabulous and beautiful palaces in the entire world, and it was completely destroyed. And many other buildings were lost in the city of Persepolis as well. In addition to this, Alexander began to experience some resistance from his soldiers and troops regarding his continued pursuit of the Persian Empire. They felt that with the capture of Persepolis, that they had revenged the Greeks for the injustice and the insult that the Persians had delivered to them back in the Greco-Persian War when Athens had been burned and destroyed. A Consequently, they felt it was time to end this battle and this campaign. Alexander, however, felt that the time had not yet come and that it was important and necessary for the battle to continue. As a result of this, though, there were a number of assassination attempts. One of these assassination attempts involved one of Alexander's generals who tried to one of Alexander's general's sons, who was involved in an assassination attempt whereby Alexander would be poisoned. When the plot was discovered, the men were arrested, and then they were promptly executed. Alexander then, fearing that his general, who had been appointed governor of Babylon, would rebel, decided that he needed to remove the governor. So he sent a messenger back to Babylon, and the messenger walks into the courtroom or throne room where the governor was holding court, saying he has a message from Alexander, opens the message, reads out that the governor's son has been found guilty of treason and has been executed, and then declares that the general has also been ordered to be executed, pulls out a spear, throws it through the governor's heart, and he dies right there. Showing some of the ruthless nature of Alexander and what he was willing to do in order to take and to keep power. At the same time, Alexander entered into a marriage with one of the daughters of Darius VII and proclaimed himself king of Persia. So this was a very momentous time, full of a lot of very important things. However, Alexander had not accomplished one of the things that he wanted to accomplish, and that was to capture Darius VII and to make this victory complete. So shortly after these events, he rode out of the city of Persepolis and continued his chase of Darius. He caught up with Darius in the city, or near the city of Passagarde, fairly close to Persepolis. He rode over a hill after having taken a few hundred cavalry with him in order to try to catch up to Darius. Saw a battlefield down below, went down and discovered the body of Darius lying there among the rest of the men who were slain on the field. Darius was still alive. So Alexander took Darius into his arms, asked him what had happened, and Darius whispers to him and tells him that he had been betrayed by one of his generals by the name of Bessus, that Bessus had turned Darius's army against him, and that they had attacked and killed him. This really infuriated Alexander. The idea that a king, someone who was in charge of everyone else, had been betrayed by his men and murdered, really upset him. And he promised Darius that he would avenge him, and then Darius died there in Alexander's arms. Alexander then continues his chase of Bessus, who moves to the north of Persia. Alexander follows him. Eventually, Alexander catches up with Bessus, surrounds his army, conquers the army, and Bessus is taken prisoner. As a way of demonstrating to everyone what the consequences are of betraying and causing harm to a king of Persia, Alexander had Bessus bound to a stake. He was whipped, and then his tongue was cut out. After that, he had all of his men and the prisoners that had been captured from the Persian army paraded past Bessus so they could see what happened to a traitor of Persia. Bessus was then loaded onto the back of a donkey, where he was transported back to Persepolis to be tried for treason. At that point, he was tortured and executed in accordance with the customs of Persia. Once again, Alexander demonstrated what he believed was necessary in order to hold on to this country and to make it his. Alexander fought many fights in Persia, but soon it became clear that all of Persia was his. Alexander was not done because he wanted to go to the ends of the earth. Aristotle had taught him about how the shape of the earth was, and he felt that the earth ended just beyond the Persian Empire in India. So Alexander set his sights on India and told his men, come on, let's go on the other side of the hill and see what's there, and let's go off to India. All right, let's go ahead and quickly summarize what we looked at. Just remember that Alexander started his conquest in Asia Minor. His first significant battle was in Issus, and he continued down to Tyre, where thousands of men, women, and children were killed and enslaved. From there, he headed to Gaugamela, where he fought Darius, who quickly and promptly ran away, capturing Darius's wife, daughters, and mother. In addition, Persepolis was unfortunately burned by the Greek armies. Before Alexander was able to find Darius, he ultimately tracked down Darius and Darius's killer, avenging him and preparing to march on to India. Well, now that we have wrapped that up, let's go ahead and take a look at what we're going to look at next time. Next time, we'll be looking at Alexander's final conquests, his return to Babylon, his death, and ultimately his legacy. We'll see you then.